thank you all for being here. We are very grateful and very blessed that internal medicine decided to bring Jim O'Connell out here for grand rounds and talks and so forth, and the Catholic community could steal him for a few hours, borrow him for a few hours on the dime of internal medicine. So we are very grateful for that, and we are thrilled to have Dr. O'Connell with us. So a brief introduction, a brief about Dr. O'Connell, and then we'll get into sort of an in-conversation mode where we have about 10 questions for Dr. O'Connell, and then we'll open it up to Q&A for all of you. So first off, Dr. O'Connell serves as president of the Boston Healthcare for the Homeless program and is assistant professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. Dr. O'Connell received his medical degree from Harvard University in 1982 and completed residency in internal medicine at Mass General. And in 1985, he began full-time clinical work with homeless individuals as the founding physician of the program. And he has served as the National Program Director of the Homeless Families Program of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Dr. O'Connell is the editor of The Healthcare of Homeless Persons, a manual for communicable diseases and common problems in shelters and on streets. His articles have appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine, the Journal of the American Medical Association, Circulation, the American Journal of Public Health, the Journal of Clinical Ethics, and several other medical journals. His first book, right here, that I'm sure will be available in the Catholic Community Gift Shop, is Stories from the Shadows, Reflections Reflections of a Street Doctor. And then his work at the Boston Healthcare for the Homeless program is the subject of a New York Times best-selling book called Rough Sleepers, also available in the gift shop. Dr. Jim O'Connell's Urgent Mission to Bring Healing to Homeless People, written by well-known author Tracy Kidder. You may be familiar with his book about Paul Farmer, Mountains Beyond Mountains. Fabulous read. That was just published earlier this year. But most importantly, Dr. O'Connell is an Irish Catholic from Rhode Island. We're both Irish Catholics from Rhode Island. And so that means we're cousins. When we reflect on when I read the books, what coming up in my mind is Matthew 25. Just reading briefly from Matthew 25. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. A stranger, and you welcomed me. Naked, and you clothed me. Ill, and you cared for me. In prison, and you visited me. Then the righteous will answer him and say, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? When did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothed you? When did we see you ill or in prison and visit you? And the king will say to them in reply, Amen, I say to you, whatever you did for the least brothers of mine, you did for me. I think that says it all about Dr. O'Connell. And in more recent terms, if you've read, for example, Pope Francis's Fratelli Tutti, where he spins off the Good Samaritan parable. I read the book. I visited with Dr. O'Connell in Boston in September. I keep thinking about Fratelli Tutti, and I keep thinking about Matthew 25. So in talking with Dr. O'Connell and his people in Boston, we decided that we would ask Dr. O'Connell some questions in conversation, and then do that for maybe about 45 minutes or so, and then open it up for general Q&A for maybe about 35 minutes, something like that, and see where the Spirit leads us. Okay? Does that sound all right?
You got me really nervous, yes.
No. You're among friends. You're among friends. First off, one thing that would help me in asking Jim some questions is to have a sense of how many people have actually read the book. Because, okay, all right, so maybe about half or so. That's helpful, just so I know, where the audience is at. Okay, questions? First off, since not everyone's read the book, or the books, they may not have as much of a background. So could you just briefly tell us about the work that you're doing today, and then after that, how you got there?
Sure. First of all, thank you all for having me. This is kind of, it's my first trip to Stanford ever, so I made it all these years without getting here, and it's absolutely spectacular, so thank you for having me. The other thing I have to thank you for is it's snowing in Boston tonight. Okay?
Yeah.
So there's no suffering on my part, just so you can know that. No, so my job, has been, basically for the last almost 4 decades now, as a doctor taking care of homeless people in Boston. And I've been, our lives are pretty much taking care of people who live in shelters. We were talking about this tonight. In Boston, we have about 95% of everybody lives in a shelter on any given night, and about 5% are outside. So it's different than many of the other cities I've seen, especially west of the Mississippi. And we do clinics in the shelters, and then I spend a lot of my clinical time taking care of people who live outside. And that's kind of, our program has grown to do that. We have a respite program, which is 124 beds of basically for people coming out of the hospital who way too sick to be on the streets and in the shelters. And so we'll take care of them there with 24-hour nursing and doctoring. And then we have a lot of little specialty things, like we take care of an awful lot of people with AIDS, we take care of older people now. We have women's clinics. We have all sorts of different clinics around town. And that's kind of what's happened. Where it came from is a little, somebody had pointed out that sometimes when you're when you hear, okay, this is what I do, it feels like there must have been a straight line here, and I can promise you it was anything but a straight line, okay? And I cringe when I hear the introduction, because what isn't there is I graduated from college about 10 years before I made it to medical school. And my mother, till the day she died, would not let me talk about it publicly, okay? So I figure if we can have more of Tom and Lori and Zach's wine, maybe I could do it a little bit more, but not now. But so what happened is I was, I graduated in 1970, which was the year of Kent State. It was tumultuous times. Many of you remember that. And so the country was as divided as I ever thought it could be. Maybe that much now, but it was really divided. And most of us, when we graduated, sort of didn't want to go into the mainstream. We were trying to find something alternative to get away from what we thought was a pretty oppressive world. So, I remember back then thinking we'd love to find what we really want to do, but it was hard. So many of my classmates and I just struggled. We tried all these different things and never quite found what we wanted until it wasn't until I was almost 30 that I realized, in fact, I was 30 when I got to medical school and finally found what I really wanted to be doing, only by accident. And then I went to medical school thinking I was going to be a country doctor. I was living up in Vermont in an old barn near the ski slopes. And I wanted to be a country doctor, but Vermont, the University of Vermont has a great medical school, but I went there to ask them what I'd have to do to apply. And they told me unless I was possessed, I'll never forget this quote. This is a man talking to me. He said, unless you're possessed of a font of human energy bordering dangerously on the pathologic, I would dissuade you from going into medicine, right? And and as Tom is a fellow Rhode Islander and Irish Catholic knows, if you say that to me, then I'm going to go for it, okay. So I ended up, going to medical school, really loved it. I found what I was doing, and then did residency and wanted to become an oncologist. I was interested in end-of-life care. And as I was finishing residency and going to do a fellowship, the city of Boston got a grant to try to take care of homeless people. This would be 1985. And so I get called into my chief of medicine's office. And I don't know how many of you are medical here, but that's like getting called into the principal's office, okay? And you get, the questions are entirely rhetorical. So He said, we have a program that's starting up. The mayor needs to get a doctor who'd be willing to do full-time work in this. They can't find one, so would you do it? And since I didn't know how to say no, I figured this would be my year of giving back. I would do it. And he delayed my fellowship for a year. And that's how I got started. So I didn't know anything about homelessness. We have a big shelter in Boston called the Pine Street Inn. It's the largest shelter in New England. But I thought it was an inn. I didn't know it was like a big warehouse shelter with 800 people. So that's how little I knew about it. And that's what happened. So I started in July of 1985. I left the hospital. My last job was running the ICU as a senior medical resident. And I kept thinking, God, I can run this ICU. It gives you a very inflated sense of ego, by the way, if you've been running the ICU after 4 years of medical school and 3 years of residency. And I figured, how tough can a shelter clinic be, which was 6 blocks down the street. And little did I know it was going to be way more complicated, and I had way less control than I'd ever had in my life. So that's how it all got started, not by my choice.
The spirit moves in different ways, doesn't it?
It does.
Now, for those of you who read the book, you may have been really struck by your first day on the job and as the doc, and you show up, and Barbara, you ask, what am I supposed to do? And she says, wash their feet. And mostly a Catholic crowd here, we're like, oh, wow, kind of Holy Thursday stuff. So could you speak to that introduction and the feet washing and what that all meant?
Well, I have a gentle version of this and then a real version. Do you want the real version? Okay. Going back to, this is my first job as a doctor. I'm 37 years old, waiting all this time to finally get a job. And so I go to the shelter thinking they're going to welcome me with open arms. I'm the first doctor to be there. I'm going to go help out. And I don't know if there are any nurses here, but this is all about nurses. There's a great nurses clinic there. They've been taking care of homeless people for like 10 years before we ever even knew what was going on. So when I walked in, the nurses they were sitting around just like this and looking at me with that stern look. I have an older sister who's a nurse, and I know the stern look of a nurse. And they explained to me that we had been trained all wrong and that I would have to listen to them and understand how to do it. And they said, you're trained in the hospital, you have to go fast. We've got 5 minutes to get the chief complaint, a little bit of time to do an exam, and then you got to make a diagnosis and treat, and then move on to the next person. And Barbara McGinnis, who was the leader of all these nurses, and Barbara was fierce but gentle at the same time. I wouldn't say that all the nurses were gentle, but she was. And I can remember her saying, if you expect any homeless person to do anything you want to do, you have to earn their trust. You have to, spend time with them, show them that you're here to stay, not that you're going to run away, share with them. We had learned to have very clear professional boundaries, right? And Barbara says, you got to let go of all that. You've got to share some of yourself, have coffee, do whatever it is so that people know you're here to care about them. And the way the nurses invited people in was they would take all these people who'd been out on the streets wandering around all day, and they invite them in. They'd call them by their name. And I didn't thought about that. And she'd say, Mr. Williams, please come in. Can we soak your feet? And just calling people by name gently was this kind of dignified thing that many people didn't hear anybody ever call by their name, at least certainly not with anything. And then they would soak their feet. And so my job, she said, for your first 2 months, I had to just soak feet. They took away my stethoscope, put it in a drawer, and anything doctoring I couldn't do. But it was really remarkable because, when you're soaking feet, you're at the foot of the person you're serving. Let me leave the Holy Thursday things aside for a moment, right? Barbara, by the way, in all truth, Barbara, I learned later on, was a real former Catholic worker who was a lay Franciscan, so she wore sandals and all that. So you're at the foot of the person you're serving and not in their personal space. And I was used to being about a stethoscope's length away from somebody's most personal space. And it was really dignified. It was comforting to people. They'd been walking all day, so it was real service. I was mentioning this to Tom. My first impression was, oh my God, I should have done my fellowship. What am I doing here on the floor at Pine Street? And it was the smelliest situation I'd ever been in, so it was oppressively smelly. But then after, a few nights of doing that and not being able to do anything else, I sort of caught on to how really, I don't want to say spiritual, but how incredibly comforting and religious it was, okay? And I was watching these really tough folks, really crusty old men, many cantankerous, everything else. But when they sat there and the nurses were soaking their feet, they became really gentle and wonderful. So I bought that. It was really quite amazing. And the story I have just to share, I may be talking too much here, I'm sorry. But there was one man that Barbara was really smart. She made me soak his feet, and his feet were so swollen, he needed a bucket for each foot. Usually we could put both feet in one bucket. And so I soaked his feet, and I realized this is a man I've seen in the emergency room dozens and dozens of times. And we had written in our chart that he had terrible paranoid schizophrenia, and he was treatment resistant, would never do anything we said. And I'm like, oh man, here he is. I wonder if he's going to recognize me. So he never said anything to me for about a month, maybe 5 weeks. And then one night he looks down at me while I'm soaking his feet, and he goes, hey, I thought you were supposed to be a doctor, right? And I looked up, and the first person in the whole 6 weeks that had said you're a doctor noticed that I was a doctor. And I said, yeah, I am. And I was thrilled that he noticed. And he said, what the hell are you doing soaking feet? And I can remember looking at him, and I didn't know what to say, and I just said, I don't know. His name was John. I don't know, but I do whatever the nurses tell me to do. And he laughed. God, it was really funny. He laughed and he said, hey, so do I. You're a good guy. So about a week after that, he asked me if I could give him something to help him sleep because he was having trouble sleeping at night. And within about another month, he was taking all the medicines that we had spent 20 years at MGH saying he was resistant to taking. And so you realize it was a magic in letting people do that on their own terms. And then I realized the nurses really knew what they were talking about.
What a great story.
Yeah.
Now, one of the disappointments in Tracy Kidder's book is they mention that Jim, after he finished college, he got a theology degree at Cambridge, in the UK. But he doesn't spend much time talking about that. So here's a wonderful opportunity to ask you about that, about your master's in theology and how that gets integrated in your doctoring.
This is the question I've been dreading, if anybody is interesting. Because, I don't think I've ever consciously woven it in, but when I think about it, so I think I was clearly, remember, I graduated, so Kent State was when they canceled all classes, the U.S. had invaded Cambodia, felt like the world was going to fall apart, and was the first year of the draft lottery. So up until then, if you were graduating, you were going to go to war or you'd have to become a conscientious objector. And I was in that first class where my lottery number was up just high enough so I didn't have to go. And so, you have that survivor, like I'm dodging this bullet without ever having to really put my life and soul on the line. And I went to Cambridge, which is like, being transported to another world. And there was nothing about Vietnam. It was just really peaceful. It's sort of like the way I see this place if I were, it's really beautiful. And so I was studying the philosophy of religion and religion over there, and I started realizing I was in search, I think, of trying to find meaning in life and what was it. And I had grown up, I grew up in Newport, Rhode Island, which is really an Irish Catholic town. At least the natives are Irish Catholic. There's no north, south, east, or west. You're in St. Joe's Parish or St. Augustine's or and I think there was some of that was just playing through, and I was trying to come to grips with it. So, but then I realized, of course, as I studied more and more of the, we had to read the Greek text, we had to do all that stuff. I started to realize this is not really what I wanted to do. But I really wanted to find something I could do that incorporated all of that, but was practical. It was doing something for people. And I think when I finally found medicine, it was kind of the realization, this is what I really wanted to do, but I wanted that foundation of understanding why. And the experience I'll tell you about, because I was awful at figuring out what I wanted to do, but I was in the Isle of Man with many years afterwards with one of my roommates from Cambridge. And the Isle of Man is in the middle of the Irish Sea. It's its own principality. It's its own country. And they have a Grand Prix motorcycle race there every year, which is really well known around Europe. It's called the TT races, Grand Prix. And it's a race around the roads on the outside. It's not a special course. It's on the roads. It's really dangerous. but I was there with my friend. It was a great thing to see, and lots of people came from Europe. And we're driving along in one of the real outskirts of town, and the guy on a motorcycle in front of us, hits the curb, flips up, and his girlfriend goes into the woods. He went and fell over and broke his leg basically almost in half. And this is a world where there's, it's volunteer fire department, so we didn't have anybody to call. So I sat with this guy while my friend went to get the volunteer fire people. And I must have sat there for maybe 45 minutes with this guy who was from Manchester, England. I could barely understand what he was saying, and he couldn't understand my Rhode Island accent at all. But we had this really interesting conversation while the two of us were trying not to look at this leg that was broken. And the conversation I had was just, it was like a little miracle. And I realized I want to be able to talk to people with this kind of way without giving an excuse of why I was here. I wanted to know how to fix that leg so I could be here to fix the leg and talk while I was doing that. And it felt like there it was. That's what I wanted to do. And that's when I decided to go to medical school. That was what it was.
Because I can see that kind of relationship with that, and even the feet washing, about that kind of intimacy that you can experience in having a sacred moment with another person who struggles.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. It was something about, being in a situation where those issues become very important and everything else kind of falls away. And I kind of, it hit.
Now, in the book, a number of stories are discussed of different folks in Boston. And the story that's kind of highlighted more than any of the other stories, or gets the most ink, is Tony.
Oh.
And he's a remarkable figure in the book, also because he sounds like he's trying to help the other folk by kind of protecting, sort of like maybe the women who were sleeping alone, in Boston and so forth. And he becomes sort of an important figure in the book. And I kind of wonder what your thoughts are about Tony, because now we know what Tracy Kidder has to say about him, but what do you think about his story, and why his story sort of rises to the forefront?
I have lots of thoughts about that, and mostly I don't want to give it. If you're going to read the book, I don't want to give anything away. But Tony was a guy who came to us one night out of nowhere. Big guy who had been 22 years in prison, really articulate and really compelling, just really out there. And he came in one night as we were trying to close down clinic, and he needed something bad. And I remember spending that evening with him because I was trying to get home, but he needed something, and I can go over that. But he just turned out to be this really interesting character who had, after all those years in prison, was still wanted to do something good for people. He just wanted to do something good. And his offense had been a type of sex offense when he was in his teens that was an attempted something, but because of that sexual offense, he couldn't get into housing, so he was condemned to being on the streets. And he was so frustrated by that because it meant he couldn't get back into society, even though he'd spent 22 years in prison. But what he decided to do then was help in any way he could. He wanted to become our assistant. He wanted to help us in the clinic. But mostly what we would watch outside, he would just find who's most vulnerable and protect them. And it was really kind of breathtaking to watch this, because here's this really tough guy who took it onto himself to be the protector of everybody. The women outside all called him the night watchman, because he would just watch while they slept, he would watch. And it allowed them to sleep at. And he just, we learned a lot about him. Tracy, the author of this, really got attached to him because he spent many hours talking to him. And they went to the Museum of Fine Arts together, where, Tony really gave quite extraordinary versions of what he thought was going on with the art. And Tracy, the author's wife, is an artist, and she was kind of blown away. So I think they just got more and more about how substantial this human being was, but that how condemned he was, that he was really not going to get out of that. And I love him. He's one of those people, I'm sure you know that, when he's around, life seems really fun, and when he's not there, it feels a little empty. And he had that kind of presence. And I think the other thing we learned, as now that you're here, is that we were trying to figure out what went wrong in his life, and slowly over the years, he would tell us a little bit of what's going on. And then it turned out he was badly abused as a child, not only by his uncle, when he was very young, but by the priest at the school that he was in. And he was really devastated by that. And that had become a sex abuser himself. So it was just a really complicated world. So we grew to love him, but knew that we couldn't help in any way. And so it was tough.
Yeah, yeah. Another element of the book that gets a lot of press, it's interesting, it gets a lot of ink, is the van, and that homeless folk don't come to you, you go to them. And you do that in, Boston that doesn't have California weather. And so I wonder if you might be able to highlight for us a little bit of your reflections on van life, you could say.
Oh, I'd be happy to. We learned, this is all part of my learning. So when we started taking care of people, our job was to get out to the shelters and take care of people in the shelters because that's where most people were. And the first winter we were doing it, we learned that most of the people who were dying were the ones who were staying outside and not coming in. So we had to begin to figure out how do we get out to those people who were going to help them. And the state gave some money to the shelter to have a van. And think of a van, it's like an exaggerated truck, basically, that could go out every night from 9 at night till 5 in the morning to just go out to these folks. And they would bring, we had these big discussions about how to design the van. I wanted it to be a medical van because I thought, heck, this is a chance to be medical. And we have a bunch of homeless people on our board of directors and who we always have to vent things with. And they were horrified. They said, no, we don't want doctors and nurses at nighttime. We want blankets and soup and sandwiches and clothing, things that we need at nighttime. So this van, which is staffed by these remarkable people, most of whom have been homeless themselves, and they're really diverse. Many are in recovery, but they go out every night from 9 to 10. There's a job, and they know everybody. Over time, they get to know everybody outside. And I got to ride along on Mondays and Wednesdays and Thursdays sometimes, as long as I would buy the coffee for everybody. If I bought the coffee, I could go. And then I would have to serve sandwiches, and I could say, oh, by the way, if you need anything, I'm a doctor too. And over time, that's how I got to know most of the people. Because we have, think about it, we only have about 500 to 600 people who live on the streets. And that's not a bad, most doctors take care of 1,500 people. So this was a relatively doable practice, as long as we knew where they were all the time. So I thought I had died and gone to heaven. I was out with these really remarkable people who were singular in that they never judged anybody. They just took everybody where they were. And then I was privileged to be out there with them. The downside to share with you one is one night early on in this, I've got my flashlight and I'm with the van people and we're under a bridge. There's these people living under a bridge near the Charles River on Storrow Drive. And it might be 2 in the morning. We're out there and I'm shining the light on this guy trying to see if he's okay. And I wanted to check on him. And he jumps up and he's really angry with me. And he said, get that flashlight out of my eyes. And then he turns to me and he said, how would you like your doctor showing up in your bedroom at 2 in the morning, unannounced, right? And it was, he was right. Oh my God, this is really invasive. Because most of us go to the doctor when we want. It's not the doctor just showing up when you're in the middle of whatever you're doing. So I'll never forget that. And when I looked at the van folks and they were like, wow, what should we do? So we had those homeless people that had helped us put us together, had a big meeting with people that lived on the street. And we had to buy the pizza and give them coffee and then get out of the way. And they spent a few hours deciding how they wanted to be served. And it was really nice that they then came out and, much to my relief, they said, oh no, if we're out there, please just check on us, especially cold nights, and it's okay. But then we got really chastised for taking the flashlights and shining it in their faces. They said, shine those damn flashlights in your face so we know who you are, not how you know. So that's what we have to do. We always keep the flashlights on our faces so they know who we are. But it was just interesting learning. And I came to love the van. It was like Boston after dark. There was no one else around, just the people who were out at night. And the streets were ours. Usually the streets are really crowded in Boston, but with the van you can go around and get to know them. I grew to love it. It's great. It's how I get to know most of the people.
Now, since this is primarily a Catholic crowd, I want to ask you about when I was visiting with you in September. I was on sabbatical at Boston College this fall and spent a morning with Jim and his staff. And one thing that kind of animated your group was talking about St. Cecilia, the parish that's nearby. And you talked about this very charismatic priest that they have at St. Cecilia, and I guess how that church fits in to the story.
Yeah, Saint Cecilia, and I'm sure your parish does something like this, but it's in the inner city of Boston, and near the downtown, and there's just a truly charismatic priest who has hundreds of people show up. During COVID, he got on. He was like one of those mega church guys, and he was on on Zoom all the time, and you could dial in. But he just had a magic about him, and the parish was all about welcoming people, just welcoming people, and it was sort of in the face of what much of the church at that time was separating people, and he was just welcoming people in. We used to wonder, how did the cardinal allow this to happen? And then as you looked around, you realized that huge numbers of very wealthy people were going to this parish. And my guess is the cardinal didn't dare do anything. But the parish had a ministry, they had a soup kitchen. They sent their, parishioners volunteered to go out during the nighttime. They always brought us extra blankets, extra food, stuff like that. And they just became part of caring for the people that were living right in the blocks right around the church. We came to really cherish that. And the music was beautiful, so it just was a really dynamic community that he organized. To this day, if you ever come to Boston, it's worth going to church there and seeing what's going on.
I was impressed too when I was there that Julie, the person who I was mostly interacting with, and and I don't know, you're a right-hand person or something like that. She, like a lot of folks in the program, seemed to have both a social work background and a theology background. And,
That's right.
And Boston College, of course, has a program that integrates those two very much. And I kind of wonder if that is something that you see more and more in the program, or is Julie an anomaly? Because it seems like a wonderful combination.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. But Julie, I wouldn't say Julie's an anomaly, but she is extraordinary in every which way. And so she had done undergraduate at Holy Cross, which is a Jesuit college nearby, and then gone and done theology at Louvain in Belgium. And then she ran a school for autistic kids. It's like so many. Well, we realize a lot of people end up in our world like having done a very, very erratic maybe, but all of it in search of finding the right place to be. And I think that's where she's not an anomaly. We have lots of really quite amazing people that have tried different things. I think in fairness, it's been a Catholic world. The number of people who have been Jesuit volunteers, who have been, lived in Catholic worker houses, tends to be really common in our world. Okay.
Now, bringing it kind of closer to home, our home, San Francisco, and our area. As you know, we have an exploding homeless problem in our local area. We were talking about how, remarkably, one of the largest homeless encampments in the United States was the jungle in San Jose, and yet we have over 100 billionaires in Silicon Valley. I mean, the economic disparity is just like breathtaking. And so, given the lessons you've learned in Boston, and you've been at this now for so many years, do you have any insights that might be helpful for us in the Bay Area in terms of, I know there's no simple answer to homelessness, but are there some principles or insights that you could offer us that are experiencing a rapidly exploding homeless problem?
Yeah, a couple things I'd throw out. First of all, that I think the more I've gotten to know and care for people who are homeless in Boston, the more complicated it seems. I used to think I had lots of answers, and now I feel like I've got lots more questions than I have answers. So it's a very complicated problem. When you think of who's homeless, it's mothers, kids, it's people with AIDS, it's elderly people, it's veterans, it's all sorts of people who in some way have been excluded or left out of whatever our society has done. And in each city that can take on a different mode. I come from that world where in Boston, if you come to Boston, you're not going to see the same thing you see in San Francisco, even though we probably have the same number of homeless people. Most of our folks at nighttime will be in a shelter and you won't walk over them when you're downtown. I hope that lasts. I don't know what's going to go on. But having a kind and caring and really clean shelter system makes a big difference, I think. And so when I hang out with my friends in San Francisco, I realize there just aren't that many shelters that people would go into. And it's nicer weather, so you want to stay outside more. So that's one, is I think sort of figuring out better options for people to be than on the street is pretty key. But I have a huge respect for how hard that can be. And the second thing I think that has happened that I learned from the van is that I don't think many things are possible unless you get to know those people, unless they get to know and trust you. And that takes months, years. We have a psychiatrist who will, when we're out on the street, she's been a full-time psychiatrist. God knows. But you know, when we'll see somebody on the street who's very, you know, thought disordered or having some sort of psychosis, and she'll try to get them to take some medicine or do something, and the person just won't talk to us. And Eileen will always turn around and say, obviously, we're on the 5-year plan, you know, and that's exactly what it will be, 5 years of just being ready to go on. So I think another solution is not to have lots of different agencies go and try to do whatever they're doing, but sort of consolidate it and get people who are going to go and get to know each of the people. And that may take, you know, I don't know how many numbers of teams, but in a place like Boston, you can do most of the people outside you can do with one good full-time team whose job it is to, you know, deputize, I guess, to get to know them and then have access to whatever it is that they need. And if you don't know their names, they'll never trust you and they don't do anything. So I think those would be the two things I'd urge. Then the rest is, you know, San Francisco is just like Boston. We don't have any housing. The housing is so expensive. There's no extra space to create new housing. And there are so many rules and regulations about what you can do when you build housing that it can take you 4 years to build the 30-unit housing thing you want to build. And it's impossibly difficult. So we have to figure out some way to address all those policies that were put up for really good reasons, but now really are the reason that we can't build housing for people like the homeless. And I think San Francisco has, all of us very liberal cities who protected people's rights and tried to make neighborhoods okay, have a more aggressive homeless problem than we ever anticipated. Anyway, I could go on about that, but sure. That's not what we want to talk about, I'm sure. But.
Another question, we're mere mortals, muggles, we're muggles. And we're not you. What do you think we can do? Are there things that we can do in your mind who are not necessarily working with a homeless population full time for, you know, 40 years, that we can move the ball forward? Even though we can't do anything magical and it's a overwhelming problem, do you have any advice for us mere muggles to move the ball forward?
I have a hard time answering that because I'm so proud of myself that I know what a muggle is, okay? So one of the things during much of this career is we didn't have any kids and we were working, you know, 100 hours a week and all that. And now we have a 10-year-old who's a Harry Potter nut. And so I've now seen the movies 5 and 6 times. I've read the books. So I'm good at muggles. But no, you know, I think about this a lot. So I'd urge you, and this is just, you know, just take it where it's coming from. Don't take this as any kind of gospel. But I've stopped thinking about homelessness as one problem, but I think of it as a couple different issues. So one question you want to ask is, how do you end this? How do we fix this? And, you know, and the answer is clearly you have to have enough housing. You have to scale housing up to enough so that people who are out there have a place to be. I think for the very vulnerable, the ones we see on the streets, chronically on the streets and in the shelters, you need the housing, plus you need a lot of support, okay? And I think that's what you're going to need to solve the problem. And then I think, personally, we were talking about this at dinner, if you were going to keep people from becoming homeless in the future, we have to fix our schools, we have to fix our prisons, we have to fix welfare systems, we have to fix foster care systems so that we don't end up with people who are devastated, you know, by the time they're 18 and end up homeless by the time they're 30. So I think there's a big societal issue that all of us, you know, have to think about and work on and advocate for, but none of us can do it. One of the hardest things we had to do was realize, I'm a doctor, I want to get this person housed, but I'm useless at doing that. I can take care of their their lung disease or their heart disease, but I don't have the capacity to change the system. And so that's one thing to think about. The other one I worry about is all the people that are currently homeless who are stuck out there, and they're not going to be housed or in somewhere for a while, maybe years. And then how do we as a society say we got to take care of them, that they're not there? And this is something I would urge you all. I think I've in 40 years met 3 people who I would say maybe they're there because they just wanted to be there. All the rest are there because of whatever's happened to them, usually as children, in schools or wherever it was, all the abuse, all the deprivation, all the racism, the poverty, you name it. And it's not their fault. But they're human beings, and they're people that are suffering that really need care. And that's something I think all of us can get involved in, sort of in an immediate way. And Barbara McGinnis, who is a nurse, I'll never forget when I'd come to the shelter, each night, and I'd walk through this gauntlet of people asking me for money, coffee, cigarettes, coffee, whatever it is. And I would say to Barbara, what do you do? How do you? And her take on this, which I'd urge you to at least think about, was that what most people are looking for is just some recognition, to not look at them as invisible. And so she said, she used to have these crazy things. On Tuesdays, I'll give them money, and other days I don't. Or she would pick on just a person that she sees every day in the same spot. She might start to give them money and talk to them. But her take was always acknowledge people and always say, sorry, I can't give you money today, but how are you doing? And then start to do that. And I think that turned the tide for me. So I never, it's a great story where Richard Gere, who I remember saying this to one of our student classes, and nobody had ever heard of Richard Gere, so this story didn't work. But he was in a movie called Time Out of Mind, which I actually haven't seen. I've been trying to find it, but he was in the movie, and he described to us what it was like. He was dressed up as an older homeless man in New York City on the sidewalk begging for stuff. And it was in a neighborhood that he lived near where he lived, right? So it wasn't like in a strange thing. And he goes, after all, I was Richard Gere. It's not like you couldn't really recognize who I was, And the cameras were up in buildings, so the cameras weren't even out front. And he said that for 8 hours, on the first day he was filming, for 8 hours, not a single person in his neighborhood looked him in the eye. And he said that was the most devastating part of the experience. And he actually went to Congress to argue for more money for homelessness, but I think that's what people are looking for. They're looking for exactly what the nurses did when they called somebody by their name and offered you to do something kind. And now that wasn't ending homelessness, but it was really caring for people. So I try to keep those things separate.
I'm mindful of our time and and I know you guys got questions, and I want to just hog Jim all to myself, but I have to avoid that. So the last question is, do you have any reflections for us about what should we know that we may not know that you know?
Ooh.
Is there anything about this issue, this problem, or not, that we should know that you know, but that we may not know?
Can we go to questions and answers or something like that?
No, we can do that.
No, I'm kidding. No, I don't, I get nervous now because, first of all, in our own program, we constantly are wondering about what good are we doing? What is the result of all this? Are we changing anybody's lives? What's the outcome? Are we saving money? All the things that you are usually sort of judged by, certainly in our world. And we have a huge, we take care of people, but the mortality rates for these folks are really awful, the premature mortality rates. And we know, like, for example, in San Francisco as well as in Boston, if you're living in a shelter, or overall, homeless people die at 4 times the rate of someone the same age. So something about being homeless, it's not the homelessness that kills you, but all the stuff that led to your homelessness and then what you have to live through off of that. And if you live on the streets of Boston, we've learned that you die a factor of 3 times that. So it's 12 times the rate. So somebody who's 34 is going to die at 12 times the rate of someone who's housed in 34. And so that's a pretty big condemnation of us as providers, right? And so, when I think of, what lessons could I give? One lesson one thing I've learned is that we're so far downstream from what's causing people to be homeless that we really are stuck caring for them and not changing it. We had to learn in our program that we're not here. Our mission is not to end homelessness. I think our fervent desire as as part of society is this is a disgrace that should never happen in a rich society like ours. But as doctors and nurses and social workers, we're just trying to dig in and take care of people who are really suffering. And I think I would urge you to, if I were going to leave some appeal to you, I'd say that, it took us years to really learn the true stories of what's going on with people. The first time you see them, you don't have any clue. You kind of get angry with them. But if you get a chance to get to know them, they will blow you away with the courage with which they're living a life that's been deprived of so much of what we take for granted. And then you kind of begin to admire that courage. But it takes patience to get to that. So I would urge you to be gentle, take time, and get to know folks.
I thought we'd end with a very brief reading from Jim's book that he didn't, this is from the foreword, so this isn't what he wrote, this is what Dr. Cohn, is it? Coe wrote.
I didn't approve this now, you know that.
You didn't
Okay.
So,
I don't even know what he's going to read here, you guys. I'm a little
just,
nervous now. Okay.
It's striking, but I think it's a good way to end this portion of our time before we get to the Q&A with all of you. And when I think of Jim and BHCHP, which is the program, I often think of the words of the theologian Father Henry Nguyen. Compassion asks us to go where it hurts, to enter into places of pain, to share in brokenness, fear, confusion, and anguish. Compassion means going directly to those people and places where suffering is most acute and building a home there. Compassion means full immersion in the condition of being human. There is deep conviction that though compassion, our humanity grows into its fullness. I think that's a good place to end. Thank you, Jim.
You're welcome. You know what's interesting about that? I didn't know you were going to say that, but he was a teacher of mine at Notre Dame.
Oh, yeah?
But I don't think the person who wrote that had any idea, but it was, so Father, no, it was amazing.
Wow.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Perfect. So thank you.
so welcome.
Let's take it, questions for you.
Thank you.
Questions, comments, free associations of any kind.
No, and I suppose I should be saying thank you for pointing that out, because I don't think I deliberately avoided that, but one thing, if you step back and I say, so we have a drug and opioid epidemic in Boston as well, most of which has happened over the last 5 to 10 years. It really wasn't as bad before. But one thing I would urge you to think about is that when we look at all the homeless people we've done a lot of in Boston and why they die, okay? You know what the leading cause of death is? It's really interesting and blew me away. It's cancer. So cancer is what is killing everybody. But then when you look behind the cancers, they tend to be what lung cancer and head and neck cancer, things that are related to a long-term smoking or using of alcohol or something like that. So it gets very complicated. The second leading cause of death, now drug overdoses are starting to become right up there, but they're just about equal with cancer, and then it's lung disease, heart disease. So one of the things we don't think about very much is how medically sick this population is. We tend to see the behavioral issues, but don't understand what's going on underneath. Now, that said, the people who live on the streets of Boston, about 80% of them suffer from what we would call a huge burden of co-occurring medical, psychiatric, and substance use disorders. And they're very complicated. They move in. The problem is what's visible to most people, including me, is their drug use. And then you sort of lose sight of what's going on behind it. And then it gets worse. It only gets worse. So we're in the same boat in Boston now we have an area that looks like it's a tent encampment that's just been addressed. But for the last 5 years, it's absorbed all of the energy and all of the oxygen in talking about homelessness. And it is it's a drug problem. Drug users are there, people that sell drugs are there, trafficking of women is there. It's very dangerous. It's completely opposite of what we used to see. And it's turned public sympathy into public antipathy, basically. And that's, I think, has been kind of devastating, because when you really get down and get to know who are these people, they're more often than not the sons and daughters of people we know or have been around. It's people that have been really devastated. But the problem is a public safety problem as well as a public health problem, and that the collision of public safety and public health is a tough one. And I think we're struggling with that all over the country right now. San Francisco turns out to be wide open, so visible. In Boston, it happens, we see it in this one spot, but it's happening all over, it's just not as visible. And we, in our program, for example, all of our doctors we have about 30 doctors now, and almost all of them are addiction medicine certified now. We do all the stuff that you can do. So we're trying like crazy to treat this. But whatever is driving the addiction, I want to argue, is the same thing that probably drove them to homelessness. And the addiction is making them feel better about that. And that's really hard to combat. But I certainly understand. It's not tolerable to have, people being stabbed to death and people being frightened walking by that. That's you can't do that in a society. So we've got a reckoning coming on all of that. But thank you for the question. That was a really good point.
More questions? Over.
Thank you so much for your comment. I
Yeah.
tried to pick up the place because it sounds to me like you really look at country doctors and really deep community. I know
Yeah.
it's in an urban setting, but we've got in the urban street world. And it's been some time. There are a couple of things I want to ask one question differently. One of the homeless person you spoke with, what did that person tell us?
I'm not, I wouldn't want to speak for them, but I can tell you an interesting thing. So we have, I told you, on our we've always had a consumer advisory board, for lack of a better word. So it's a bunch of homeless people who we have to go to when we have any new idea, any new spending, something. And from that group, there's 5 of them who sit on our board of directors, which is a 14-member board of directors, right? And we're not a big program, but we're like $85 million now. It's sizable. So it's a big chore. Okay. Now, 2 of the, all of those people have lived on the streets or lived in the shelters for a while. And one woman in particular comes often to speak in a setting like this. And if she were around, I would love to have had her here. And she does, for example, she speaks at the white coat ceremony at Harvard Medical School every year. She's a woman who's lived on the street, she's now housed, lived on the street for 30 years. Horrible stories of emotional and sexual abuse as a child, raped many times, had her eye stabbed out when she was sleeping on the street one night. So really has a compelling story, and talks about how crazy she was. She was, riding motorcycles and doing crazy stuff and doesn't quite understand why. And she tells that to all of the students, and then talks about what her experiences have been like when she went into the hospital and was treated not very well by our staff. And she always ends it, but after she tells her that, she said, now your job, she looks at all the brand new white coat freshman medical students, she said, your job is to remember it might be me when the next person you see in the hospital, and don't be, and she'll call it, don't be a bullshit doctor. And do you know every medical student remembers that? It just sort of catches you off guard on that first day. But I think that's, if we were a pure medical audience, that's what she would say. The rest she would say, I think, is all, I'm a human being. Can you try to help us understand how we're more together than we are apart?
By the way, some wisdom from a Jesuit friend of mine, who, Father Bob, you might know, Mark Revisa. What always stuck with me was basically every interaction, with people, respect, compassion, reverence. You remember those 3 things? every interaction goes better. And I think that's really good words to live by from my point of view. You had a question?
Yes, I do. Can you tell me about the teens, how they get there, what the future is going to be, the teenage?
The teenage ones. Oh my gosh, yes. From what I know, so in Boston, we have, in our program, we have a whole part of our program that takes care of families, mostly moms with kids. And then we take care of people, adults, 18 and older. And in Boston, there's a great program called Bridge Over Troubled Waters, started by a priest in the 60s, which takes care of the adolescents. And we try to keep them out of the main shelters and keep them out of that stuff. And they're quite an amazing organization. It's been around for 45 years. And they are the ones that we tend to depend on for helping us with teens. And it's a little different. The numbers are relatively small. So in Boston, there might be 45 teenagers, roughly. And one of the big problems is that the family shelters, once a boy in a family shelter hits the age of 13 or 14, they can't stay in the family shelter anymore. So they're kind of separated from their families because it's too dangerous, according to the shelters, to be in the shelters. So a lot of the teens we see are people that have been sort of like emancipated from their family, which is really meaning they have no family. And they're tough. They've lived through, really pretty unspeakable trauma. But the name of the game there is, at least from what I know from my Bridge Over Troubled Waters colleagues, is they just are trying to catch them at that age and not let them go on to the next stage. But often drug use can get in the way. There's all sorts of personality issues that come up and psychiatric issues. So I think that's the population we should spend an immense amount of time on, because they are the next generation of homeless people if we don't do that. On the good side, it's still relatively small numbers for us. 45, where there are 8,000 homeless people in Boston on a given night, 45 will be teenagers.
Yes, yes.
Thank you so much. Really appreciated everything you shared. I was curious, as you and your team kind of deal with burnout or maybe even a sense of hopelessness in a way, because the homelessness problem continues to grow and it feels like there's no end in sight, like all the policy changes and things that people try to do, and kind of even on a day-to-day basis. So I work for the Santa Clara Valley Homeless Program.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Some people do well, and some people are kind of cycling back. I've been there for almost 7 years now, and I see some of the same people struggling with some of the same things. And so, we have success stories, and then we also have people who are sort of kind of in their, struggles.
Right. Two quick comments. One is I spent a few days with the center, and your program is spectacular. I was just talking to Dr. Larry Kwan today, and he was part of the original part of that, right? And Cheryl Ho. But the other thing is, you're the psychiatrist. I should be asking you this question, okay? And it is a big problem, because what our goal, just so you know, is we think things only work if you can have good continuity of care. So you don't want somebody to come and spend 6 months and then leave, or a year and then leave. And homeless people hate that, because they've spent all this time opening to you and sharing. And then if you leave, it's devastating for them. And they don't have many people that stick with them in their lives. So part of the name of the game is, how do you create an environment where, despite the tragedy you're looking for, and despite all the bad stuff going on, there's still some sort of joy in taking care of somebody. And our take on that is that we were forced by the homeless people that put us together. This is kind of interesting, that we had to work. They hated me, when I started. I didn't tell you about the nurses already hated me, but the homeless people were even worse, because they hated anything that smacked of charity. Okay, they didn't want it. They wanted social justice. This is 1984. Okay. And they insisted that it has to be continuity of care from the shelter in the street right through to the hospital, and then into respite care, which is what we do. But in doing that, they said, well, you're going to have to work in teams, right? And they would not let me have my own panel of patients. So I don't have a panel of patients that only come to see me. I work in a team with a nurse practitioner, physician assistant, and now a psychiatrist, a full-time psychiatrist, and we share in the care of the same people. We don't have separate things. And so when there's joys, you can celebrate, but then when there's real tragedy, like when someone you've really gotten close to dies, which happens all too often, then you've got a cushion of people that can support each other. And then you have the other homeless people that you get to know. So I think what we've learned is, as long as people on the team have been there a long time, then they can carry through the rest of the team. And then having there's a community, I think, of homeless people, and being close to that community and sharing in the grief is actually really important, I think. And so I think if you came and worked with us, as I know you would, the same thing in Santa Fe, and I would argue this, not argue, but I'd bet anything, you would be surprised how joyful most days are. Even though I can't believe I'm saying that, but that's, you come in, people are there because they really want to be there, they've got a mission, they know they're helping out, they know they're getting close to people, even though they have to accept, damn it, I can't change this awful system. So that's the name of the game, how to do that. But what's your thought on that? Because you would know way more than I do.
I'm still trying to put it together because I think we're still recovering from all the stress of the COVID pandemic. Because having to navigate all of that, and we've had some leadership changes as well that sort of post-pandemic. So I think I'm just trying to put together sort of we've had a lot of staff turnover in certain areas. So I think like you were saying with continuity, when you have new people sort of in the program spending a lot, it's hard to
Wow.
right.
Boy, do I so am there with you. I understand, yeah.
More questions? Yes, sister.
Thanks for sharing. I really related to the story because I used to work with homeless. I used to work in New York.
In New York.
I understand that situation, and I'm not involved in it. I really used to work on homeless. I used to live in Southern California, and I did project for homeless in Seattle. I don't know if you heard about Seattle. So for my dissertation, I did a project for homeless for almost a year, and finally I really gave up because the homeless live everywhere. We don't stay at one place. I cannot follow them from equality is my project. Right in my project. But even though that, I still, in my heart, is still for homeless. Because I did a project studying about homeless for almost a year. So even though the women are homeless, the place was raped by homeless men. And as you know, the homeless have a lot of comorbidities. Anxiety, PTSD, a lot. I used to work with Southern California, so I know that the homeless cannot and they don't like to stay in a shelter. When I talked to them, they said, please don't put me to shelter. I want to live on the street. So I asked them if they want more freedom on the street. So when you go into a shelter, you have to be there on time. And you cannot drink like wine, you cannot smoke. There's a lot of things that we say. So they prefer to stay on the street. Even though I explained to them, and then for rain, you come to ER and I have a broken knee. And we could get out, we have to do all the tests, and we know that we don't have a problem anymore. We just want to sleep for the night. And we have a meal at dinner, and the next day, breakfast, two meals at dinner. So it's my morning shift, if there was not a lot of patients, so I left them there until I saw another patient come in, and I told her, it's time for me to go. I can't keep you anymore. And I gave them breakfast for the night. Because not the night was left.
first of all, if you worked on Skid Row in Los Angeles, my heart is out to you, because I've spent a considerable amount of time there, and it is like living on another planet. I can't believe how awful it is, right? It's also awful when you come from a place where, while homelessness is terrible, most people are in a shelter and not out like that. And your question, I think, is really profound and kind of provocative. Like, why is it that we have 90% of the people or 95% of the people in Boston going into a shelter, whereas when you go to LA, you won't be able to get people to go into a shelter or issue? And I don't know the answer to that. I just know there's, one, Boston's cold, so people might want to come in because it's cold. But even in the summer, people come into the shelters because it's air conditioned. So I don't know whether it's just a long tradition of having shelters, which I think comes out of, most of the shelters in the East Coast, if you look at them, all started as, religious shelters of some kind. And then the government came in and said, we like what you're doing, and now they're funded by the state or the government or the federal government or the city government. And they're secular in that sense. Pine Street Inn that I was talking about where Barbara was, used to be the urban priests that run it. Now it's run by HUD money and city money and state money. But they were really well run and they were really caring. So I think if there's a tradition of a caring shelter where people come in and they're welcomed, you've got a fighting chance of convincing people to come in. If you don't, if they look like, take a number and go sit there and all that, I think it gets really hard for people to choose to do that rather than be outside. I'm fascinated in Boston about we have a shelter bed for anyone who wants one in Boston. And I'm always fascinated by those that say no, but it's a small percentage. And the reasons they say no are really complicated. And the story that I remember most, the one that haunts me most, is I was trying to, on a cold night, it was minus 10 degrees on the Fahrenheit, bitter cold night, it wasn't snowing, but it was just freezing cold and windy. And there's a man who I grew to really respect and love, who was under a bridge, stayed there every night, and it was so cold, I said, look, this is a frostbite night, you've got to come in. And he looked at me and he was really gentle and he said, look, Doc, you don't understand. He said, when I go into the shelter where there's 600 other people, I can't tell which voices are mine. But when I'm here under the bridge, I know these are my voices, I can deal with them. And he realized that's a complicated reason. And so I've come to respect that people often have great reasons not to come in. But that's in the context of knowing there's a welcoming shelter that they could choose if they wanted to. And in that setting, I think most people choose to go in our town. Maybe the tradition, and maybe that Los Angeles, for example, has never had many shelters, so there's no real easy tradition of it. I don't know. And it would be, I don't know how you did on your project, but I know you had to abandon it for stuff. But that's asking those questions about why people don't come in and learning what's wrong would really be helpful to all of us, especially the people in LA, about what can you do, and San Francisco. Why don't they go in?
We're starting to run out of time. We want to be mindful of time, so maybe we could take one more question, and then we'll do a few thanks and wrap up so we keep to the schedule. So the final question, this will be the good one, right?
I think it'd be helpful to keep it a friendly question. So thank you, Dr. Knopfler. I had a question just about if you could share your thoughts and experiences from a public policy standpoint you have with the homelessness program you developed, from particularly a local or state or the national level that you've had, and the successes and the challenges you've had in having resources to stand in front of the program.
That is a great question, by the way. It's also a great one to end on because it's like a never-ending cascade. So, my experience is that this is a really huge societal problem that's going to take some fun. If you just think about what it's going to cost to get the housing necessary for just the people out there now, there's 700,000 people estimated to be out homeless tonight in America, and if it costs, $500,000 or $600,000 for each unit, think of how much that costs to house all of those people. It goes into the trillions, not the billions. And I don't see any government appetite for doing that at this point. But if we're going to solve the problem, we're going to have to at least start, sort of like post-World War II, we need to start with a big housing project. So I think that's clear. But then I think what we have seen around the country San Francisco, and other places, is really remarkable programs that have learned what you do for certain segments of that population. And so let me prelude that by saying, I don't think one solution is going to work for everybody. Everybody's different. You're going to have a project that works for this group of people. It's like personalized medicine. You're going to need personalized housing. So some people want to be in a group setting, some want to be alone, some need a lot of support, some don't need much at all. But you've got to be able to adjust to that. We don't have any mechanism right now for doing that. What we have, though, is programs that have shown that it's really successful, get somebody housing, put a lot of support with them, and people thrive. So we know what to do. Just that it's very expensive, and we're in a world where what can you do that will save us money over here? And the truth is it's going to cost a lot of money for us to right a wrong that's been going on for generations. But how do we get people to do that? So I would say simply, we know if we can do properly supportive housing for the populations that are most, have the most obstacles to care, then we'll make a huge dent in the problem. We just have to be willing to spend that money.
Well, thank you. We wanted to end just with a few thanks. We want to thank Sister Gloria back there and Father Xavier for helping to get all this to work. So we're very grateful. We also want to thank you for coming on a cold and rainy Northern California night.
Snowy night.
Snowy night in Boston. And of course, we want to thank our guest of honor, the wonderful Jim O'Connell. Thank you.
Thank you.